Card fraud fell in the UK last year. It was down 20% in the first 6 months to £187 million. Yes, it's still a lot, but it's the lowest it's been for more than 10 years. Chip and PIN is the main reason why, that's according to the banks. But engineers at Cambridge University have managed to breach chip and PIN security with a device that they say many criminals could make and use. Now the banks are telling them to take the relevant research paper off the university website. Melanie Johnson chairs the UK Cards Association. Ross Anderson is Professor of Security Engineering at the University of Cambridge. Professor Anderson, without giving too much away, can you explain to us in very simple terms how your team breached chip and PIN security?
Well, back in 2008, 2009, we got quite a number of people contacting us who said that their cards had been stolen and then had been used either in cash machines or in merchant terminals, that they couldn't possibly have compromised their PIN, and yet the bank said that since it was a chip card and the PIN was used, it must be their fault. So we did some research to find out what might be going on, and in October 2009 we discovered that it was easy to bamboozle a chip and PIN terminal so that it thought it was doing a chip and PIN transaction while the card thought it was doing a chip and signature transaction. And this meant that you could use a stolen card with any PIN that you liked.
No.
So we told the banks about this in early December 2009. The usual procedure in such cases is we give people a couple of months to fix their systems before we go public. And we finally went public on Newsnight in February 2010. Some banks, Barclays for example, fixed their systems, but not all banks have. And in the beginning of December, the UK Cards Association sent a letter to Cambridge University's Public Relations Director insisting that he take offline the thesis of one of our students who described some testing equipment you could use to explore this flaw. And this, of course, goes against our deepest principles. We don't unpublish lawful material once it's been published.
Melanie Johnson is from the UK Cards Association. Have all your members managed to plug this particular security gap?
Were the security gap to be breached, then there's always an audit trail, and in fact there's absolutely no evidence that this is taking place whatsoever. So, as you've said, fraud has fallen massively.
But let's just put that to one side for a moment. Before we get on to whether criminals have used it or not, we've just heard that the banks have had since October 2009 to fix this. Some of them have. The allegation is, but not all of them. Tell me what you know about that.
Well, the issue is actually about whether there is a problem with this. It's a very complicated device. I mean, one thing that I think listeners need to understand is that actually the commonest forms of fraud and the ones that we spend a lot of time and effort effectively combating are the ones that are the simplest. The ones that the University of Cambridge have constructed are technologically quite difficult to do, as it were, and actually do involve a lot of complicated gizmos. And you have to steal a card and then use it. It has to be a valid card that's out there, and then use it while it's still valid, using their terminal.
With respect, you're answering lots of questions I haven't asked you. What I'm asking you is it true that some of the banks have managed to close this loop and others haven't?
It's up to the individual companies what response that they make to individual issues like this, but there is absolutely no evidence that this is a kind of fraud that's taking place, and indeed our figures show that fraud has fallen massively last year and the year before, so that cumulatively we've had a 28% fall in 2009 and I think about a 20% fall in the year that's just finished.
Why then, if you don't believe anyone else could do this kind of fraud, that it's very complicated, and you don't believe anyone has ever done it, are you asking the university to take a PhD thesis research paper off their website?
Well, we're not asking for that, and we made it very plain in the letter, and the letter's very specific. What we objected to was the detail of disclosure that has gone on, the publication of a blueprint. It isn't the publication of the research. We don't have any problem with that. We welcome any constructive criticism, and we work very constructively with a lot of academic departments elsewhere in the country. We have, for example, a relationship with Royal Holloway London. But what we have done is objected to the level of disclosure, the very explicit detail which was revealed when some of this information at a detail that has never been published before was put on another website. It wasn't the publication of the initial research.
Professor Anderson?
Well, the thesis in question was the MPhil thesis of Omar Chowdhury, one of our students who built a piece of equipment whose primary goal is to enable banks and shopkeepers to check whether their systems are secure. And without this independent checking, you simply can't tell whether fraud is feasible or not. With respect, Ms. Johnson may say that there's no evidence that this fraud is going on. That's not our experience, because it was reported fraud that caused us to look for this vulnerability. And if banks don't have the means of looking for it with the systems that they had in the old days, then they're never going to see any of the evidence. Now, another very important public policy issue is that if you complain about a disputed transaction, the banks nowadays will look to see whether it was authorised by PIN or not. And if it was authorised by PIN, they blame the customer, and if not, they charge it back to the merchant. What our research shows is that most banks simply didn't know whether a PIN had been used or not. Now, at the same time, I believe that the reason for the fall in fraud is that over the past 3 years, the proportion of customers who suffer fraud, according to customer studies, who end up out of pocket has gone up from about 17-18% to over 40%. So what's really happening is that the banks are being very much more aggressive at blaming customers and merchants for fraud without knowing whether, in fact, a PIN was used to authorise a transaction.
But aren't you being irresponsible, putting so much information online, enough for somebody to make one of these gadgets that your people have made, if they so desire?
We published the attack itself in February alongside the Newsnight programme, and it appeared at an academic conference in May. This has been in the public domain for a long, long time. Omar's thesis has been out since about July or August of this year. And again, that's been in the public domain for a long, long time. Now, the banks clearly had a bizarre idea that by complaining to the university's public relations director, they could get something taken down. Of course, this was completely counterproductive, because attempted censorship simply caused a furore which resulted in the material being read by 30,000 people instead of by perhaps 3 people.
Melanie Johnson, how then do you respond? They're obviously not going to take it down. They don't accept that it's a fraud that has never been used. What are you going to do now?
Well, first of all, I mean, it is actually, we regret it's their decision to give it more publicity. As I've made very clear, it's not the thesis or the publication of the thesis nor any of the earlier work that they published that we had any objection to. It's the very explicit details they put on about the advice on a further website that we're objecting to. We appealed to the university because they have a good research practice guide which says researchers must do the dissemination and publication of research responsibly and with awareness of the consequences of any such dissemination in wider media.
With respect, they feel they have done that, don't they? They've more than done that. They've given you lots and lots of notice. This is very old research.
You have to say, who is this information about a device for fraud actually going to help? What the detailed publication, not the research, but the detailed publication. Who is that going to help? And as for the fraud figures, I think it's very important that Ross Anderson and your listeners understand that the total fraud figures include anything, whether it is ultimately charged to the customer or not, and that the customer under the lending code is always assumed to be innocent of any fraud, and that the industry has to show, if it wants not to pay for that fraud, that the customer is in some way responsible for the fraud taking place.
We must leave it there, Melanie Johnson.
Cut fraud shows how successful we're being.
Thanks for coming on. Thanks to Ross Anderson, who I have to say was shaking his head throughout all of that. No doubt you'll email us with your experiences.